Hi, everyone. My name is Eden Cho, and I'm a museum educator at the National Museum of American History. And welcome to the 2022-2023 National Youth Summit on Democracy. This is our third program that we're bringing to you over the course of the school year, and we will be culminating in a teach-in event next month. So whether you've been joining us or whether this is the first time you're jumping in, we're really happy to have you here today. A few housekeeping items before we start. Please ask any questions you may have by commenting in the chat box, and our guests will answer them live. We only ask that you keep your personal information private. And I'll also be using the chat to drop important information like additional resources, forthcoming case studies. So keep an eye on the chat. This video will stay archived at the same link, so feel free to come back to it and watch again as needed. But you won't be able to see the chat once you're in the archived version. So I will be sure to highlight the websites where you can find all the information you need. I'm going to turn over the introductions to our moderator today, Megan. And you might even hear her cat Tallulah in the background, just as an FYI. Megan?
Thank you, Eden. Hello. Yes, my name is Megan Linehan. I am an education specialist at the National Museum of American History, and I am joined here today by my cat Tallulah, but also our museum specialist and from the curatorial division, Noriko. So welcome, and can you introduce yourself and just give us a little bit of information about what you do at the museum?
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for inviting me. I'm Noriko Sandekuchi. I'm the museum specialist at the National Museum of American History. I work with Asian American and Pacific Islander subjects matter. So I do involved in collections and also doing programs and exhibitions. I look forward to the conversation this afternoon.
Thank you so much. And we're really happy to have you here today on this beautiful spring day here in the DC area. So just as a little bit of background before we get into the meat of our webinar, the National Youth Summit this year is a series of case studies for middle school and high school students that are trying to tackle the big question, how do the stories that we tell about the past shape our democracy? And so we are looking at how groups and individuals have provided examples of civic engagement that goes beyond voting. And we invite you to examine history as a tool for understanding our present and shaping our shared future. So this is the third in our series of case studies. And we are excited to talk about, well, maybe excited is not the right word, interested to talk about Japanese American incarceration during World War II and how the story of that actually has had a major impact on the civil liberties that we may take for granted. So to dive in, well, actually, before we dive in, just a quick note on the language we're going to use today. The government at the time used euphemisms that obscured the nature of what was really happening during this time period. And so we are going to use language that is recommended by the handbook produced by the Japanese American Citizens League. And Eden is going to share that reference in the chat, so you have access to that as well. Okay, so with that, let's dive in. So the focus of this case study, as I said, is Japanese American incarceration during World War II. And we are looking at the focus question of what tools are available to shift, expand, or reimagine the story of democracy in the United States. And so I thought we could start with a little bit of historical context about what happened during World War II. So we have our first image up here, and we have a sign at the Manzanar War Relocation Center. And so in 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and the United States entered World War II. Noriko, what can you tell us about the government's decision to force Japanese Americans into incarceration camps in 1942?
Yeah, so after the attack on the Japanese Empire, that was December 7th of 1941. So just 11 weeks after that, at the time, FDR was the president, and FDR issued a Executive Order 9066 on the following year, which is February 19 of 1942. And what that means is, in that document, it doesn't really say anything about Japanese in the language per se. United States was in war with not only Japan, but also with Italy and Germany as well. But that language has applied to the Japanese and Japanese Americans at that time. So who was affected during that time was the people who were living on the west coast of the United States, that they were considered dangerous at that time. So they uprooted and rounded up the Japanese Americans who were living mostly on the west coast. So like from the Pacific North, state of Washington, and also California. So people were uprooted and moved to the inner lands of California, Arizona, Utah, and Arkansas. So there were 10 major relocation, and this is what the photo that you're seeing is Manzanar, which is about 3-hour drive from LA into Manzanar area.
And so the Japanese Americans who ended up in these camps, some of them were citizens, right?
Yeah, that's correct. So
Okay.
if you have to give a number, that's about 120,000 of them. But surprisingly, 2/3 of them were American citizens.
Wow. That's an incredible number. To dig a little bit deeper into the camps, what was life like for these incarcerees?
So what was it like? So first of all, they were moved to like horse stalls, and or like Seabiscuit. Some people might remember the racehorse Seabiscuit. So you're like in Santa Anita for the temporary places. And then further on, you're moved into barracks were made for, in quote unquote, like more permanent incarceration sites. And average-wise, the incarcerees were in their duration of the World War II, so about average from 3 to 4 years. And they're like barracks, and you're mostly like middle of nowhere, inland. It's like desert, but that was intended because you're in places that you cannot escape. If you're trying to escape from the camps or prison camps, incarceration sites, there's nowhere to go. And one of the thing is, so it was very hot, muggy in the summer, and very cold in the winter time. There was like snowing. And then one thing that the condition was, there was no privacy. That was the big thing. When you talk to these former incarcerees, that's what they talk about, is like no privacy. So I think a lot of the people who are tuning in might be, you're in teenagers or you're in schools. So when you go to a camp or you're going with a friend, it's a little bit different feeling that when you go to the bathroom, shower, there's no way to have privacy with your friend, that they can see everything. So that's one of the thing that they talk about, is no privacy. And also there was the family structure was a little bit broken up. So, and then especially like larger places, there were about thousands or 10,000 people were just pushed into these incarceration sites. And you had to do things together. There were certain time, even though you're going to the restroom or shower, as I said earlier, but if you're getting your meals, you have to go to the mess hall, get your ticket, line up, and get feeded.
So not to mention that you were also under guard, which is, you can see one of the guard towers here. So there were barbed wire fences and guard towers, and I'm assuming the guards were armed as well. So it sounds very uncomfortable.
Right, so, yeah, let me add just to that, to the guard tower. Yes,
Yep.
As everybody's looking at this guard tower. So the idea was the government was protecting the incarcerated, they were protecting the Japanese Americans, but then the guns were pointed inwards. So that's like something to think about. They were just watching, guarding the Japanese inmates versus the outside. So that's kind of like an irony. Yeah.
Very thought-provoking. And so you mentioned there were roughly 120,000 incarcerees at these 10 different incarceration camps. Because this is such a large group of people, I imagine there were different reactions to what happened. So could you share some of the different ways Japanese Americans reacted to these circumstances?
Are you referring to, okay, yes. So when they're placed into their incarceration sites, so the major ones, there were 10 of them, but if you include like the Department of Justice and the first generations who were like priests, had anything to do with the Japanese government, they were placed in especially a more high secure center, justice centers. So that will be about like 75 of them. So that's a much larger group. But yes, and answering your question, so one of the Japanese American responses were they decided to join the army when it opened up for the Japanese Americans. And within they're in the incarceration sites, you're locked behind by your own government. As I said, 2/3 of them are American citizens. And the second generation who were born in the United States are becoming like turn of like 20th, they're becoming their adulthood. So that's when they are volunteering to fight for American unit. So they're leaving, volunteering from the incarceration site to fight and could die for the American military, for the government, while your family and siblings are incarcerated by the United States government. So there were about 30,000 Japanese American soldiers, and also there were a few Japanese American women who also participate as well. And that's quite some interesting intriguing is people who went to the European theater. It's actually a highly decorated Japanese American Nisei soldiers called the 442. And they went to the 442 went to the European theater, while because their Japanese Americans are only one generation removed. So when you're communicating with your parents, or also if you're educated in Japan as a childhood, that they have the language skill set. So a lot of them joined the MIS, which is called the Military Intelligence Service, and they worked in the Pacific arena. And then some of the women or some of the incarcerees who were left behind, who are still in the incarceration camps, were making camouflage net. And so a lot of them were participating in the war effort altogether as well. But also some people decided like, oh, I'm not going to fight for my government who put us in prison camps. So they decided to speak out and go against the military as well. So there were different responses among the Japanese Americans, how they reacted to this.
That is so interesting. I do wonder what I would have done in those circumstances, whether I would have volunteered to join the army while my family was incarcerated. So that's an incredible story. Okay, so we are going to move on to our next object here, which is our No More Manzanars protest sign. And Noriko, I'm going to let you tell a little bit more about this protest sign in just a moment, but I believe this sign features Yuri Kochiyama, and I'm just going to provide a little bit of context for her. So Yuri was a young Japanese American woman who was incarcerated at Jerome camp in Arkansas as a young woman. That's where she met her husband, Bill, who I believe was in the Army. And after they left Jerome, they moved to New York City. And that's where she became an activist during the 1960s at the height of the civil rights movement. She worked with Malcolm X. She supported political prisoners, and she really acted as a bridge between the Black and Asian activist movements and also East and West Coast activists. So we're going to look at another object related to her in a moment, but what would you like to add or tell us about this poster, Noriko?
Yes, thank you. So this Yuriko Chiyama's No More Manzanars sign was caught on my eye when there was a women's march back in 2017. And this one was at the LA location. And when I saw that sign, I thought, wow, that's very powerful. And then more so when I found out who made this and who was holding it, that it became even more powerful object, because it was also made in a collaboration with the Yonsei artists. Yonsei means fourth generation. So this individual's grandparents were incarcerated during World War II. So he's a descendant. So it has a meaning to personal narrative to it. And also the art was provided by a Muslim American artist. And of course, this is after 9/11, and a lot of the artists got together and raised their voices for civil rights, social justice. And it was a narrative like of current day in like 2017, what it means for democracy and then voicing your rights. And I thought it was a great artifact to be documented at the American History Museum. So that's the narrative. And of course, Yuriko Chiyama is such an icon. So a lot of people will see, when they see that stencil or the poster, colorful ones, like, oh, that's Yuriko Chiyama. So she's such an icon in American history.
Great, thank you for that context. We're going to come back to this poster and kind of tie it all together, but I want to look at another object here. So this is a letter that Yuri wrote, and on behalf of the East Coast Japanese Americans for Redress. And I thought this letter was interesting for a number of reasons. You'll notice the date in the upper right-hand corner is 1981. And I highlighted a word, a phrase, and a sentence in this letter. So if you can't read it right now, I recommend going back and checking it out. But the word that I highlighted in that very first sentence is redress. And that's not a word that we hear very often, but I believe it means something similar to reparation. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, great. And so the other thing I highlighted in this was the East Coast is particularly uninformed of this aspect of US history, referring to Japanese incarceration. I believe this is because you said, as you said earlier, the Japanese Americans affected by Executive Order 9066 we were on the West Coast. So the East Coast may not have been as informed about this. And then I also highlighted the sentence, given the current political climate we are living in, we feel it is urgent that the public be informed of what has happened and what can happen to a whole segment of the population based on ethnic heritage. And so that gives us a nice segue into the next question I wanted to ask you, Noriko, and that has to do with what this letter is referring to, which is the establishment of the Commission of Wartime Relocation an internment. And I was hoping, it's a mouthful, I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about that commission, what it did, and what its significance was.
Yeah, sure. So I'll spell it out the first time. The Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians was appointed in 1980 to officially study the impact of President Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066 on February 19, 1942, and make recommendations as to how those wartime actions could be redeemed. So in 20 days of hearings held all over the United States, including 3 hearings in Alaska, to review the impact of Executive Order 9066, the 9 commissioners heard testimonies from over 750 people and also reviewed scholarly writings, archival documents, and personal records. The Japanese American community made many moving statements at the hearings and the hearing process itself, and had a cathartic effect for many former incarcerees. If you haven't had a chance, I mean, it's amazing just to hear these testimonies. It is available at some of the archives that you can have access. Okay, and also the commission issued a report called the Personal Justice Denied in December of 1982. And this anonymously report describes the history of the camps and hearing process and the research undertaken and the commission's recommendations based on its finding. The commission found that despite no military necessity and no documented evidence of sabotage or espionage by Japanese Americans, the government still conducted a policy of inclusion, removal, and detention that resulted in losses of jobs, property, education, and even more. So let me just quote, racial prejudice and wartime hysteria and the failure of political leaderships, end quote, were found to be the cases of the problem, and the commission recommended an apologies, pardon for those convicted for curfew and other minor wartime violations, restitutions of statues of positions lost, establishment of an education foundation, and $20,000 to each of the surviving 60,000 Japanese Americans former incarcerees. So the significance of the commission is that they recognize quantifying the recommended remedies for the federal government's unjust wartime actions. So then in doing so, it vaccinate future generations against these recurrent of the wholesale violation of rights.
Okay, and ultimately the commission's research and the activism of the 1970s and 80s was successful. And I have this next object here, which is HR 442. And this is what President Reagan signed into law, which did provide an apology and to Japanese Americans incarcerated, $20,000, a $20,000 payment to all surviving incarcerees, right? And did it establish that the recommended education foundation or fund, or was that part?
Yes, that was part of it.
It was. Okay.
That was part of it. But just one thing to notice is when you do the math, it took 40 years to get to this stage.
It did. So this was signed in 1988, correct?
Correct. So a lot of the time that people who really suffered, like especially the first generation and the second generation, they were passing on. So they didn't benefit because, as I mentioned, that surviving incarcerees were only available to receive this money. So,
okay. Yes, 40 years seems like an eternity to wait for that sort of acknowledgement of the injustice that was done. Okay, so as we start to wrap up, just to recap, we spoke a little bit about the history of Japanese Americans being incarcerated based off of their ethnicity in the 1940s during World War II. We looked at the letter and learned a little bit more about this long campaign to make the United States confront the injustice that was done to them in the 1970s and 1980s. And then we had that poster that features Yuri Kochiyama, and that one is from the Women's March in Los Angeles in 2017. So to start to wrap things up, how do we start to connect these dots? Why does this history still matter?
Well, why does it matter? So the redress movement that led to judicial and legislative remedies for the Japanese Americans represents one of the most successful multi-partisan efforts of the U.S. history to hold the government accountable for its unwarranted, harmful actions. Successful signing of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 and the successful Koren Nobis cases of Min Yasui, Gordon Hirabayashi, and Fred Korematsu were part of the widespread movement of the reclaiming of Asian American history and Asian American studies, and empower the community through the first large cohort of Asian American lawyers. Once some measure of justice was accomplished for Japanese American former incarcerees, many who were involved in that redress movement continued on to fight for justice for women, the LGBTQ+ community, and other people of color. And once the example of the successful redress campaign was publicized, other groups issued it as a model, as it's seen in the current Redress Commission focus on African Americans in California. So it just comes to saying that like collaboration, and the Japanese Americans have been on the front line. They're trying to collaborate with other groups and trying to help them with their other issues as well. Because back in 75, 80 years ago, there was nobody for the Japanese Americans, but the Japanese Americans has experienced this, so they can help and mobilize the community as well.
Yeah, mobilization and to build coalitions to mobilize is so important. Okay, well, thank you so much for everything you've been able to share with us today, Noriko. Eden, was there any final questions or comments in the chat before we start to wrap up?
No questions in the chat, but I just wanted to highlight Noriko's comment about people coming together, especially people in communities that have been historically marginalized and oppressed, especially as we're coming out of Black History Month, we're in Women's History Month, we're approaching API Heritage Month. I hope that this program has been helpful, just thinking about intersectionality, and that this is an important topic to learn about, not just in May, not just in your World War II curriculum, but yeah, thank you for joining us.
Excellent point. Couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you, Eden. Okay, so that means we have 2 minutes to wrap things up. So thank you so much for everyone who watched live and everyone who will hopefully watch this in the future. And also thank you to Eden and our guest Noriko for joining us today. The associated case study with this webinar is coming soon and will be up on the National Youth Summit webpage, as well as all of the archived webinars. And then a ton of other resources are embedded in the case study. So there's lots to explore. And so then I also have, I'm happy to announce that we are going to do one final Youth Summit event to wrap up our democracy series. And this will be on April 25th, 2023, from 1:30 to 3:30 p.m. in the afternoon. We are going to host a virtual National Youth Summit teach-in. And we are going to touch on the case studies that we've already done webinars on, but we're really going to try to be building towards having civil conversations about this key overarching question: how do the stories we tell about the past shape our democracy? So we hope that you will join us for that. We are asking people to register for this, and I believe Eden is going to put the registration link, which is live, in the chat. So we hope that you will register and come join us to engage in some civil conversation on April 25th. All right, did I forget anything, Eden?
I think you got it all.
All right. Great. Well, I'll take that last line then. Again, thank you to our guests, and thank you to anyone who is viewing this. We look forward to seeing you in April. I hope you have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Bye.